Welcome, dear listener, to a collection of stories meant for quiet moments and peaceful rest. Tonight we journey together through some of the most extraordinary encounters between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human heart. These are stories of transformation, of unexpected meetings that changed the course of history and touched individual souls in ways that echo through time. Let these gentle tales wash over you as you prepare for rest, carrying you into a space where the sacred and the everyday meet in perfect harmony. In the beginning, when the world was younger and the veil between heaven and earth seemed thinner, there were moments when the divine touched human lives in ways so profound that they rippled through generations. These were not ordinary meetings, not chance encounters on dusty roads or in bustling marketplaces. These were sacred appointments, carefully orchestrated meetings between the Creator and creation, each one unique, yet sharing a common thread of transformation and wonder. The ancient world understood something that we sometimes forget in our busy modern lives. They knew that the divine was not distant, not unreachable, but intimately present and ready to break into human experience at just the right moment. They lived with an awareness that at any time, on any ordinary day, the extraordinary might unfold before their eyes. In those times, shepherds watched their flocks under star-filled skies, their hearts open to mystery. Prophets walked among the people, their spirits attuned to whispers from beyond. Kings and peasants alike carried within them the possibility that today might be the day when heaven would bend down to touch their lives. This expectancy, this readiness for the sacred, created an atmosphere where encounters with the divine could flourish. The stories we're about to explore together are not mere historical accounts or religious traditions. They are windows into the human soul's deepest longing for connection with something greater than ourselves. They speak to that part of us that knows, without doubt, that we are more than flesh and bone, more than our daily concerns and earthly ambitions. We are beings created for communion with the divine, and these stories remind us of that beautiful truth. As we begin this journey together, imagine yourself transported to those ancient times, feeling the sand beneath your feet, the warm breeze on your face, the anticipation in your heart. Feel the weight of ordinary life lifting as we step into the realm where miracles become possible and where every encounter has the potential to change everything. The first story takes us to a lonely place beside a flowing river, where a man wrestling with his past and his future would discover that sometimes our greatest struggles become our most sacred encounters. Jacob stood alone by the river Jabbok as darkness settled over the land like a gentle blanket. The water murmured softly as it flowed past, carrying with it the whispers of night and the promise of dawn still hours away. Behind him, his family slept peacefully in their tents, unaware that this night would mark a turning point not just for their father, but for generations yet to come. The stars above seemed closer somehow, as if heaven itself was leaning down to witness what was about to unfold. For 20 years, Jacob had lived in exile, working for his uncle Laban in a distant land. 20 years of tending flocks, of building a family, of growing in wisdom and wealth. But tonight, as he prepared to face his brother Esau after all these years, the weight of his past pressed heavily upon his heart. The memory of that day long ago when he had deceived his aging father and stolen his brother's blessing haunted his thoughts. Would Esau forgive him? Could the wounds of the past ever truly heal? The night air was cool against his skin as Jacob walked along the riverbank, his mind churning with worry and hope in equal measure. He had sent gifts ahead to Esau, peace offerings that he hoped would soften his brother's heart. But deep inside, Jacob knew that some things could not be resolved with material gifts. Some wounds required a different kind of healing, a transformation that could only come from a divine encounter. As midnight approached, Jacob found himself in a place of solitude, away from the comfort of family and the familiar sounds of camp life. Here, beside the flowing water, in the space between yesterday and tomorrow, he was utterly alone with his thoughts, his fears, and his hopes. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against stone and the distant call of a night bird. It was then that he appeared. At first, Jacob thought it might be a traveller, perhaps someone seeking shelter or directions. But as the figure drew closer, there was something different about him, something that made Jacob's heart quicken with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The stranger's presence filled the space around them with an energy that was both calming and electric, both familiar and utterly mysterious. Without words, without warning, the stranger reached out and took hold of Jacob. What began as what might have been a greeting transformed instantly into something far more intense. It was not a fight born of anger or hostility, but rather a wrestling match that seemed to emerge from the very depths of existence itself. Jacob found himself locked in struggle with someone whose strength seemed both human and more than human, whose touch carried with it the weight of eternity. Hour after hour, they wrestled there by the river. The struggle was unlike anything Jacob had ever experienced. It was not merely physical, though his muscles strained and his breath came in short gasps. It was not merely emotional, though every feeling he had ever suppressed seemed to rise to the surface. It was a wrestling of the soul, a grappling with the very essence of who he was and who he was meant to become. As they struggled, Jacob began to understand that this was no ordinary opponent. There was something divine about this wrestling match, something sacred about the way this stranger seemed to know his every move before he made it, seemed to understand his every weakness and strength. Yet the stranger did not overwhelm him with superior power. Instead, he matched Jacob's effort with his own, creating a struggle that was perfectly balanced, perfectly designed to bring out something deep within Jacob's spirit. The hours passed like minutes and like years all at once. Jacob's clothing became torn, his skin bruised, but still he held on. Something within him refused to let go, refused to surrender, refused to walk away from this encounter unchanged. He sensed that this struggle was the most important thing that had ever happened to him, more significant than his birth, his marriages, the birth of his children, or any achievement of his life thus far. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, painting the horizon with soft pastels of pink and gold, the stranger seemed to grow more urgent. "Let me go," he said, his voice carrying both authority and gentleness, "for the day is breaking." But Jacob, though exhausted, though every muscle in his body screamed for rest, tightened his grip and replied with words that would echo through history, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." In that moment, Jacob understood what he had perhaps known all along but had been afraid to acknowledge. This was no mere human opponent. This was a divine encounter, a meeting with the sacred that had come disguised as a wrestling match. His request for a blessing was not just the desperate plea of an exhausted wrestler, but the cry of a soul that recognized it was in the presence of the divine and would not let such an opportunity pass without receiving what it needed most. The stranger's response came in the form of a question that penetrated to the very core of Jacob's being. "What is your name?" It seemed like such a simple question, but Jacob knew it was anything but simple. To give his name was to acknowledge who he had been, to own his past with all its deceptions and failures. Jacob meant heel-grabber, deceiver, supplanter. It was a name that carried the weight of his history, his mistakes, his broken relationships. "Jacob," he whispered, and in that admission something broke open within him. He was acknowledging not just his identity, but his need for transformation. He was admitting that Jacob the deceiver, Jacob the trickster, Jacob the one who had lived by his wits and cunning, was not enough for what lay ahead. He needed to become someone new, someone worthy of the promises that had been made to his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac. The stranger's touch upon Jacob's hip was gentle but transformative. In an instant, Jacob felt something shift within his very bones, a wound that would become a reminder of this sacred encounter for the rest of his life. But with that touch came something far greater than physical pain. It came with new identity, a new name that would echo through the ages. Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed. Israel. The name meant he who struggles with God, or God struggles. It was a name that honoured both Jacob's tenacity in holding on to the divine encounter and God's persistent love that would not let him go. It was a name that acknowledged that sometimes the most sacred encounters come disguised as struggles, that growth often requires us to wrestle with questions we cannot easily answer and challenges we cannot easily overcome. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape and painting the river with ribbons of gold and silver, the stranger began to fade like morning mist. Jacob reached out, wanting to hold on to this moment, wanting to make it last forever. "Please tell me your name," he called out, but the divine visitor only smiled with a mysterious gentleness and was gone, leaving Jacob alone by the river with a limp that would last a lifetime and a blessing that would last for eternity. Jacob stood there in the early morning light, transformed. The man who had arrived at the river the night before as a fugitive running from his past had been replaced by Israel, a man ready to face his future with courage and faith. The physical struggle had ended, but Jacob understood that the spiritual struggle would continue throughout his life. He had learned that encountering God often means being willing to wrestle with difficult questions, to hold on to faith even when it seems impossible, to refuse to let go until blessing comes. He named that place Peniel, which means the face of God, saying, "I have seen God face to face, and my life has been preserved." As he limped back toward his family's camp, each step a reminder of his sacred encounter, Jacob carried with him not just a new name and a blessing, but a new understanding of what it means to meet the divine. It was not always comfortable, not always what we expect, but it was always transformative. The river continued to flow as it had for countless centuries, carrying with it the memory of that night when heaven touched earth in the form of a wrestling match. Birds began their morning songs, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the world awakened to a new day. But something fundamental had changed. A man named Jacob had become a man named Israel, and through him an entire nation would inherit not just a name, but a legacy of wrestling with God and discovering that in that struggle they were never truly alone. Years passed, and the descendants of Israel found themselves in Egypt, where prosperity gave way to slavery, and hope seemed as distant as the promised land their ancestors had known. In those dark days, when the people cried out under the weight of their bondage, another man was tending sheep in the wilderness, far from the centres of power and politics. He had no idea that he was about to become part of a story that would echo through eternity, that his quiet life as a shepherd would be interrupted by an encounter that would change not just his destiny, but the course of human history. Moses walked slowly behind his flock as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The wilderness of Midian stretched endlessly in all directions, a landscape of rocky hills, sparse vegetation, and profound silence. It was a place where a man could think, where the noise of civilization faded into whispers of wind and the soft bleating of sheep. For 40 years Moses had called this wilderness home, 40 years since he had fled Egypt as a young man, leaving behind a life of privilege and the weight of a terrible secret. The sheep moved lazily in the heat, seeking whatever shade they could find among the scattered acacia trees and rocky outcroppings. Moses knew every path in this wilderness, every watering hole, every place where the grass grew a little greener. He had become skilled in reading the subtle signs that told him where to lead his flock for the best grazing, how to protect them from predators, how to find water in a land that seemed determined to hide its sources of life. As he walked, Moses often found his thoughts drifting back to Egypt, to the Hebrew slaves labouring under the harsh whips of their taskmasters, to the cries that rose from the brick kilns and building sites. Sometimes, on particularly quiet afternoons like this one, he could almost hear their prayers carried on the desert wind. He had tried to help them once, had intervened when he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, but his attempt at justice had resulted only in exile and the painful knowledge that he was not the deliverer his people needed. The flock had wandered farther than usual today, drawn by some instinct toward a part of the wilderness that Moses rarely visited. Here, the terrain was more rugged, with steep rocky faces rising abruptly from the desert floor. Mount Horeb loomed ahead, its summit hidden in afternoon haze, a mountain that the local people considered sacred, though Moses had never given much thought to such beliefs. To him it was simply another landmark in the endless expanse of wilderness where he spent his days. As the sun began to sink lower, casting long shadows across the landscape, Moses noticed something unusual. On the slope of the mountain, not far from where his sheep were grazing, there was a bush that seemed to be on fire. At first he thought little of it. In this dry climate, vegetation sometimes ignited spontaneously, especially during the hot afternoon hours. But as he watched, something about this fire captured his attention in a way that made him pause and look more carefully. The bush was definitely burning. Moses could see the flames dancing among its branches, could almost feel the heat from where he stood. But something was wrong with this picture, something that defied his understanding of how fire worked. The flames continued to burn, bright and vigorous, but the bush itself remained green and healthy. The branches were not being consumed. The leaves did not wither and fall. It was as if the fire existed independently of the bush, using it as a dwelling place rather than fuel for its appetite. Moses found himself walking closer, drawn by curiosity and wonder. In all his years in the wilderness, he had never seen anything like this. Fire was fire. It consumed what it touched. It burned until its fuel was exhausted, then died away, leaving only ashes and charred remains. But this fire seemed to exist by its own power, sustained by something beyond the natural laws that governed the physical world. As he approached, the crackling of flames became audible, but there was something else, something that made Moses slow his steps and listen more carefully. Beneath the sound of burning was another sound, subtle but unmistakable. It was like a voice, like someone speaking very softly, words that seemed to come from the fire itself. Moses stopped walking and stood perfectly still, straining to hear, wondering if the isolation of the wilderness was finally affecting his mind. But the voice came again, clearer this time, unmistakably real and unmistakably calling his name. Moses, Moses. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the fire and from the mountain itself, from the very air around him. It was not harsh or frightening, but it carried with it an authority that made Moses' heart race and his knees grow weak. This was not the voice of another shepherd calling across the wilderness. This was something entirely different, something that spoke with the weight of eternity behind it. "Here I am," Moses replied, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. He felt suddenly small, suddenly aware that he was in the presence of something infinitely greater than himself. The ordinary afternoon had transformed into something sacred, and he understood instinctively that he was standing on holy ground. "Do not come any closer," the voice said gently but firmly. "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." Moses obeyed immediately, though his hands shook as he bent to untie his sandals. The earth beneath his bare feet felt warm, as if heated by some inner fire, and he could sense the presence that filled this place like water filling a cup. As Moses straightened up, his sandals in his hands, the voice continued, and with each word, Moses felt his understanding of the world shifting and expanding. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At these words, Moses hid his face, overwhelmed by the realization that he was not merely witnessing some strange natural phenomenon, but was in the very presence of the Almighty, the God whose promises to his ancestors had sustained the Hebrew people through generations of waiting and suffering. The voice that came from the burning bush carried with it the weight of history and the promise of future. I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, God said, and Moses could hear in those words both infinite compassion and righteous anger at the injustice his people had endured. I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Moses listened with growing amazement as God laid out a plan that seemed impossible in its scope and audacity. The Hebrew slaves, powerless and oppressed, would be freed from the mightiest empire on earth. They would leave Egypt and journey to a land that would become their inheritance, a place where they could worship freely and live according to the laws and promises God had given to their fathers. It was a vision that took Moses' breath away, a dream that seemed too wonderful to be real. But then came the words that changed everything, the words that transformed Moses from a spectator to a participant in this divine drama. Come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. The fire seemed to burn brighter as these words were spoken, and Moses felt the weight of divine calling settle upon his shoulders like a mantle both precious and heavy. Who am I? Moses protested, his voice filled with doubt and humility, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? The task seemed impossible. He was a fugitive from Egyptian justice, a shepherd who had spent the last 40 years in the wilderness. How could he possibly stand before the most powerful ruler on earth and demand the freedom of an entire people? What authority did he have? What power could he possibly wield against the might of Egypt? But the voice from the burning bush was patient and reassuring. I will be with you, God promised, and in those simple words Moses heard an assurance that transcended all his fears and doubts. And this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. The very place where Moses now stood, this holy ground where the divine presence had revealed itself, would become a place of celebration and worship for the freed slaves. Still, Moses struggled with the magnitude of what was being asked of him. If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? It was a question that went to the heart of identity and authority. The Hebrew people had heard stories of their God for generations, but they had also been surrounded by the gods of Egypt, deities with names and titles and specific powers. How would Moses convince them that he had been sent by the one true God? The answer came from the fire with a power that seemed to make the very mountains tremble. I am who I am, God said, and in that name was contained all of existence, all power, all truth. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. It was a name that spoke of eternal existence, of self-sufficient being, of the source from which all other life and reality flowed. This was not just another God among many, but the God who was the foundation of all existence. As the encounter continued, God gave Moses detailed instructions about how to approach the Hebrew elders, how to present his case to Pharaoh, how to demonstrate divine power through miraculous signs. Moses learned that his staff would become a serpent at God's command, that his hand could become leprous and then be healed instantly, that water from the Nile could be turned to blood. These were not parlour tricks, but demonstrations of the power that would be behind him as he faced the impossible task ahead. Even so, Moses found one more objection, one final protest against his calling. "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." He had never been a public speaker, had never possessed the kind of charismatic presence that could move crowds or convince skeptics. How could someone like him stand before Pharaoh and the Hebrew people and speak with the authority that such a mission would require? But God's response revealed the depth of divine patience and provision. "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." The God who had created the capacity for speech would provide the words that needed to be spoken. Moses would not be alone in this mission. He would be accompanied by divine wisdom and power every step of the way. When Moses continued to express reluctance, God's patience remained, but the plan expanded to include Aaron, Moses' brother, who would serve as his spokesman. The divine mission would not be stopped by human weakness or fear. God would work through whatever instruments were available, transforming ordinary people into agents of extraordinary change. As the sun sank lower toward the western horizon, the encounter began to draw to a close. The fire continued to burn in the bush, as bright and consuming as ever, yet the branches remained green and unconsumed. Moses stood there in bare feet on holy ground, his life forever changed by what he had heard and experienced. The quiet shepherd who had arrived at this mountain a few hours earlier was gone, replaced by a man with a divine mission, a calling that would reshape the ancient world. The flames seemed to whisper final words of encouragement and promise as Moses gathered his sandals and prepared to return to his flock. He had encountered the God of his fathers in a way that no human being had ever experienced before. He had heard his name called from the fire, had received a commission that would echo through history, had been given assurance that divine power would accompany him in the impossible task ahead. As Moses walked back toward his sheep, the ordinary world seemed somehow different. The rocks and trees, the desert wind and evening shadows all remained the same, yet everything had been transformed by the knowledge that the divine presence was not distant and unreachable, but intimately involved in human affairs. The God who spoke from burning bushes was the same God who heard the cries of slaves and would move heaven and earth to set them free. The mountain behind him held its secrets in silence, but Moses carried with him the memory of that sacred fire, that voice that had called him by name, that presence that had transformed an ordinary afternoon into the beginning of one of history's greatest adventures. He had learned that sometimes the most extraordinary encounters come disguised as the most ordinary moments, that divine calling often comes to those who feel least prepared to answer it, and that the God who creates burning bushes that are not consumed is more than capable of accomplishing the impossible through willing human hearts. Centuries passed, and the people whom Moses had led out of Egypt had settled in the promised land, had built cities and established kingdoms, had known both triumph and defeat, faithfulness and rebellion. In the royal city of Jerusalem, the temple that Solomon had built stood as a magnificent testament to divine glory, its courts filled daily with the smoke of sacrifices and the songs of worshippers. It was here, in this sacred space where heaven and earth seemed to touch, that another man would experience an encounter with the divine that would change not only his life, but the very way people understood the holiness and majesty of God. Isaiah walked slowly through the temple courts as the morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones. He was a young man of noble birth, educated in the ways of the court and familiar with the religious traditions of his people. Like many of his generation, He had grown up taking the temple for granted, accepting its rituals as part of the established order of things. The priests performed their duties, the sacrifices were offered, the people came and went in their seasonal observances, and life continued with a comfortable predictability that made the sacred seem almost ordinary. But this morning was different. King Uzziah had died, and with his passing an era had come to an end. Uzziah had been a good king for the most part, a ruler who had brought prosperity and military strength to Judah. His death left the kingdom facing an uncertain future, surrounded by enemies and internal challenges that would test the faith of the nation. Isaiah had come to the temple not just out of habit, but out of a deep need to understand what God might be doing in these troubling times. As he entered the inner courts, Isaiah found himself drawn toward the Holy of Holies, that most sacred space where only the high priest was permitted to enter, and then only once a year on the Day of Atonement. He stood as close as he dared, his heart heavy with questions about the future of his people, about the meaning of recent events, about his own role in whatever was to come. The familiar sounds of temple worship surrounded him, but today they seemed muted, as if he was hearing them from a great distance. It was then that the ordinary boundaries of the world seemed to dissolve, and Isaiah found himself transported beyond the physical temple into a realm where earthly and heavenly realities merged into one overwhelming vision. The walls of the temple seemed to expand infinitely, or perhaps Isaiah's perception had expanded beyond the limitations of physical space. Either way, he suddenly found himself in the presence of something so magnificent, so awesome, so utterly beyond human comprehension, that he fell to his knees in speechless wonder. Before him, rising to heights that seemed to touch the very foundations of heaven, was a throne unlike anything that had ever existed in any earthly palace. It was not made of gold or precious stones, though it gleamed with a light that made the finest metals seem dull by comparison. It was not carved by human hands or designed by human imagination, for it possessed a beauty and majesty that transcended anything the mortal mind could conceive. This was the throne of the Almighty, the seat of power from which all creation was governed, the centre from which divine love and justice flowed out to every corner of existence. Upon the throne sat the Lord, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Isaiah could not look directly at the divine face, for the glory was too intense for mortal eyes to bear. But he could sense the presence, could feel the weight of infinite holiness and perfect love, could understand without words that he was in the presence of the source of all life and light. This was the God whom Moses had encountered in the burning bush, the God who had wrestled with Jacob by the river, the God whose promises had sustained the Hebrew people through centuries of triumph and trial. Above the throne, flying in perfect formation, were creatures that Isaiah would later describe as seraphim, beings of pure light and worship, whose sole purpose seemed to be the adoration of the divine presence. Each had 6 wings, and their movement created currents of air that seemed to carry the very essence of holiness throughout the heavenly temple. With 2 wings they covered their faces, for even these exalted beings could not look directly upon the divine glory. With 2 wings they covered their feet, in humble recognition of their position as servants before the eternal throne. And with 2 wings they flew, moving in patterns that spoke of joy and reverence and perfect submission to the divine will. But it was their voices that overwhelmed Isaiah's senses and penetrated to the very depths of his soul. In perfect harmony, with a power that seemed to shake the foundations of heaven and earth, they cried out to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." Each repetition of holy seemed to reveal new depths of divine perfection, new aspects of the purity and transcendence that belong to God alone. The word echoed and re-echoed through the heavenly temple, creating harmonics that spoke of truths too profound for human language to express. The sound of their voices was so powerful that the posts of the doors were shaken, as if the very structure of reality was responding to this declaration of divine holiness. The temple began to fill with smoke, not the ordinary smoke of incense or sacrifice, but a cloud that seemed to be the visible manifestation of divine glory itself. This was the same glory that had filled the tabernacle when Moses completed its construction, the same presence that had settled upon Mount Sinai when the law was given, the same divine reality that had guided the Hebrew people through their wilderness wanderings. As Isaiah knelt in the presence of this overwhelming vision, the contrast between divine holiness and his own humanity became painfully clear. In the light of perfect purity, every flaw in his character, every selfish thought, every moment of pride or anger or indifference stood out like stains on fresh snow. The realization of his own sinfulness in the presence of absolute holiness filled him with terror and despair. "Woe is me," he cried out, his voice breaking with anguish, "for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." It was not false modesty or exaggerated humility that prompted these words. In the presence of divine holiness, Isaiah was experiencing what every human soul would experience if suddenly brought face to face with the perfect purity of God. He was seeing himself as he truly was, recognizing the gap between human nature and divine perfection, understanding that no amount of good works or religious observance could bridge the chasm between the holy God and sinful humanity. But even as Isaiah despaired of his unworthiness, divine grace was already in motion. One of the seraphim flew to him, carrying in his hand a live coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar that stood before the throne. The coal burned with a fire that was both purifying and healing, both painful and merciful. As the seraphim touched Isaiah's lips with this sacred flame, he spoke words that would transform Isaiah's despair into hope, his sense of unworthiness into readiness for service. "Behold, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." The touch of the coal was unlike anything Isaiah had ever experienced. There was heat, but it was not the destructive heat of ordinary fire. Instead, it was the warmth of purification, the burning away of everything that separated him from the divine presence. In that moment, Isaiah understood that the holiness he had witnessed was not merely transcendent and unapproachable, but also immanent and transformative. The same God whose glory filled the heavens was willing to reach down and cleanse human hearts, to prepare earthly vessels for heavenly purposes. As the coal touched his lips, Isaiah felt a profound change taking place within him. The shame and fear that had overwhelmed him just moments before were being replaced by a sense of peace and wholeness he had never known. His lips, which he had declared unclean, were now purified and ready to speak words that would carry divine authority. His heart, which had been heavy with the knowledge of his own sinfulness, was now light with the joy of forgiveness and restoration. Then came the voice of the Lord himself, not harsh or condemning as Isaiah might have expected, but gentle and inviting. "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" It was an invitation to service, a call to participate in the divine mission of bringing light to a world that often preferred darkness. The same God who had called Moses from a burning bush, who had wrestled with Jacob by a river, was now seeking someone who would carry his message to a people who desperately needed to hear it. Without hesitation, transformed by what he had experienced, Isaiah responded with words that would echo through the centuries. "Here I am. Send me." The fear and reluctance that had characterized Moses' initial response were absent from Isaiah's reply. The cleansing he had received had not only removed his sin, but had also filled him with courage and eagerness to serve. He had seen the glory of God and lived. He had been touched by divine fire and purified. He had heard the voice of the Almighty and been invited to join in the work of redemption. The commission that followed was both sobering and inspiring. Isaiah would be sent to speak to a people whose hearts had grown hard, whose ears had become dull of hearing, whose eyes had been closed to spiritual truth. His message would often fall on deaf ears, his warnings would be ignored, his calls for repentance would be rejected. Yet he was to continue speaking, continue proclaiming the word of the Lord, continue holding out hope for those who would listen and respond. But woven through this sobering commission was a thread of ultimate hope. Though judgment would come, though the people would face the consequences of their choices, God's purposes would not be thwarted. A remnant would remain, a holy seed from which new life would eventually spring. The same divine power that had cleansed Isaiah's lips would one day purify the hearts of the people, and the glory that filled the heavenly temple would one day fill the earth as the waters cover the sea. As the vision began to fade and Isaiah found himself once again in the familiar surroundings of Solomon's temple, he carried with him an indelible memory of what he had seen and experienced. The earthly temple, magnificent as it was, now seemed small and dim compared to the heavenly reality he had witnessed. The daily routines of worship, important as they were, now carried for him a depth of meaning they had never possessed before. More than that, Isaiah carried with him a new understanding of the character of God. He had learned that divine holiness was not a barrier that separated God from humanity, but rather the very quality that made divine love so pure and transformative. He had discovered that the God who dwelt in unapproachable light was also the God who reached down to cleanse and commission ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. He had experienced firsthand that an encounter with the divine was not something to be feared by those who approached with humble hearts, but rather something to be treasured as the greatest privilege a human being could ever receive. The young man who had entered the temple that morning carrying questions about the future of his nation left as a prophet, carrying answers that would shape the spiritual understanding of countless generations. He had seen the Lord high and lifted up, had heard the songs of the seraphim, had felt the touch of purifying fire, had accepted a commission that would define the rest of his life. Most importantly, he had learned that the God who reigns from the highest heaven is intimately concerned with the affairs of earth and constantly seeking those who will serve as bridges between the divine and human realms. Many centuries later, when the promises spoken through Isaiah and other prophets had found their fulfillment in ways both expected and utterly surprising, another encounter would take place on a dusty road between two ancient cities. This meeting would be different from those that had come before, for it would involve not just a voice from heaven or a vision in the temple, but a direct confrontation with the risen Christ himself. The man who would experience this encounter was perhaps the least likely candidate imaginable, a zealous persecutor of the very movement that claimed to follow the promised Messiah. Saul of Tarsus rode hard along the Damascus road, his heart burning with righteous anger and his mind focused on the task ahead. The sun beat down mercilessly on the small company of travellers, but Saul barely noticed the heat or the dust that swirled around them with each gust of desert wind. His thoughts were consumed with plans for the arrests he would make once he reached Damascus, the Christians he would bind and bring back to Jerusalem for trial. In his view, these followers of the executed teacher Jesus were dangerous heretics who threatened the very foundations of the faith he had sworn to protect. Saul had been present at the stoning of Stephen, had watched with approval as the young deacon was killed for his bold proclamation that Jesus was the promised Messiah. He had seen the strange peace on Stephen's face as he died, had heard him pray for forgiveness for his killers, but Saul had interpreted these things as the delusions of a fanatic rather than signs of divine truth. To him, the followers of Jesus were enemies of God, people who needed to be stopped before their blasphemous teachings could spread any further. The road stretched ahead, shimmering in the heat of midday. Damascus was still hours away, but Saul felt energized by his mission, confident in his authority and certain of his righteousness. He carried with him letters from the high priest, documents that would give him power to arrest any followers of the Way he might find in the synagogues of Damascus. His reputation as a persecutor of Christians was well established. Families had been torn apart by his zealous pursuit of those who dared to claim that a crucified criminal was the Son of God. As the sun reached its zenith, casting short shadows beneath the feet of horses and men, Saul's world was about to be turned completely upside down. There had been no warning, no gradual build-up of spiritual awareness, no sense that this day would be different from any other. One moment he was riding confidently toward Damascus, secure in his mission and his beliefs, and the next moment heaven itself seemed to tear open above him. The light that suddenly blazed around Saul was unlike anything in his experience. It was not the warm natural light of the sun, though that orb was already shining brightly overhead. This was a light that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a brilliance that made the desert sun appear dim by comparison. It was not merely bright, but alive, pulsing with a power and presence that penetrated to the very depths of Saul's being. This light carried with it the unmistakable signature of the divine, the same glory that had filled the temple when Isaiah received his vision, the same presence that had spoken to Moses from the burning bush. The intensity of the light was so overwhelming that Saul was immediately struck blind and fell from his horse to the ground. His companions, terrified and confused, also fell prostrate, though they experienced the encounter differently than Saul. They heard the sound of a voice, but could not make out the words. They saw the light, but not its source. This was Saul's encounter, his appointment with destiny, his moment of divine confrontation that had been ordained before the foundation of the world. As Saul lay on the ground, trembling with fear and confusion, a voice spoke to him in Hebrew, the language of his childhood, the tongue in which he had learned the scriptures and offered his prayers. But this voice carried with it an authority and gentleness that penetrated straight through his shock and terror to his heart. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" The question was simple, direct, and devastating in its implications. The repetition of his name spoke of intimate knowledge and personal concern. This was not a distant deity speaking to humanity in general, but someone who knew Saul personally, who understood his history, his motivations, his deepest beliefs and fears. But the content of the question shattered Saul's understanding of what he had been doing. He thought he had been persecuting heretics, enemies of God. Now he was being told that his persecution was directed against this mysterious speaker himself. "Who are you, Lord?" Saul managed to whisper, though his voice was weak and his body shook uncontrollably. The title Lord came naturally to his lips, for there was no doubt in his mind that he was in the presence of divine power. But the identity of this Lord was still unclear to him, though a terrible suspicion was beginning to form in his mind. The answer came with a clarity that cut through all his confusion and resistance. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads." In that moment, Saul's entire worldview collapsed and was rebuilt in an instant. The Jesus he had believed to be a dead heretic was alive and speaking to him from heaven. The Christians he had been persecuting were not enemies of God, but servants of the risen Messiah. Everything he had been doing in the name of righteousness had actually been opposition to the very God he thought he was serving. The metaphor of kicking against the goads spoke to something deep within Saul's experience. He had grown up around farming and knew how oxen sometimes fought against the sharp sticks used to guide them, only injuring themselves in the process. Perhaps, in his heart of hearts, Saul had sensed that his persecution of the Christians was somehow wrong, that he was fighting against something that might actually be from God. The peace on Stephen's face as he died, the courage of the believers even under torture, the way their numbers seemed to grow despite persecution. These things had perhaps created doubts that Saul had suppressed but never fully overcome. Trembling and astonished, Saul asked the question that would define the rest of his life. "Lord, what do you want me to do?" It was a complete surrender, an acknowledgement that everything he had believed about his mission was wrong, and a willingness to be redirected by the very person he had been persecuting. The zealous persecutor had become a humble seeker in the space of a few moments, transformed by an encounter that left no room for doubt or compromise. The voice of Jesus continued with instructions that were both immediate and mysterious. "Rise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." There were no detailed explanations, no lengthy theological discussions, no immediate clarity about what his future would hold. Instead, there was a simple command to trust, to move forward in faith despite his blindness, to wait for further revelation that would come through human instruments in the city ahead. As the light faded and the voice fell silent, Saul struggled to his feet with the help of his companions. The man who had begun this journey with such confidence and clarity of purpose was now blind, confused, and completely dependent on others for guidance. But he was also transformed in ways that would become clear only gradually. The encounter had lasted only minutes, but its effects would resonate through the rest of his life and ultimately through the entire course of human history. His companions, shaken by what they had witnessed, helped the now blind Saul back onto his horse and continued the journey to Damascus. But everything had changed. The man they were supporting was no longer the fierce persecutor who had set out from Jerusalem. He was someone new, someone who had met the risen Christ face to face and had his entire understanding of reality revolutionized in an instant. For 3 days, Saul remained in Damascus, staying in the house of a man named Judas on the street called Straight. He neither ate nor drank during this time, spending his hours in prayer and reflection, trying to process what had happened to him. His physical blindness seemed to mirror a spiritual darkness that was being gradually illuminated by the truth of what he had experienced. The scriptures he had memorized from childhood were being reinterpreted in light of his encounter with the risen Jesus. Prophecies he had never understood were suddenly becoming clear. The pieces of God's plan were falling into place in ways he had never imagined possible. During these 3 days of darkness and fasting, Saul was having visions, preparing him for what was to come next. He saw a man named Ananias coming to restore his sight, a preview of the divine orchestration that was about to unfold. Meanwhile, across the city, Ananias was receiving his own vision, being told by the Lord to go to the house on Straight Street and minister to the man who had come to Damascus to arrest Christians. Ananias' initial response revealed the reputation Saul had earned through his persecution of believers. "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who call on your name." The very mention of Saul's name struck fear into the hearts of Christians throughout the region. He was known as their most dangerous enemy, the one who showed no mercy in his pursuit of those who followed Jesus. But the Lord's response to Ananias revealed the complete transformation that had taken place on the Damascus road. "Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake." The persecutor had become the chosen vessel. The enemy had become the apostle. The one who had caused suffering for the name of Jesus would now suffer for that same name. When Ananias finally arrived at the house on Straight Street, his greeting to Saul was both gentle and profound. "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you came, has sent me that you may receive your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." The word brother must have been particularly meaningful to Saul, representing his acceptance into the very community he had been persecuting just days before. As Ananias placed his hands on Saul, something like scales fell from his eyes, and his sight was immediately restored. But more than physical blindness was healed in that moment. The spiritual blindness that had kept him from recognizing Jesus as the Messiah was also removed. The man who had been breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord was now ready to join their ranks and eventually surpass them all in his zeal for spreading the gospel. Saul arose and was baptized, marking his public identification with the Christian community. He broke his 3-day fast, regaining his physical strength for the mission that lay ahead. But the most remarkable transformation was yet to be fully revealed. Within days, this former persecutor would be preaching in the synagogues of Damascus, proclaiming that Jesus is the Son of God, to the amazement of all who heard him. The encounter on the Damascus road had accomplished in a matter of minutes what years of rational argument could never have achieved. Saul had not been convinced by theological debate or won over by the example of Christian martyrs. He had been confronted directly by the risen Christ himself, and that encounter had changed everything. His brilliant mind, his thorough knowledge of Scripture, his passionate zeal, all of these qualities that had made him such an effective persecutor would now make him an incomparable apostle. The man who would become known as Paul carried with him for the rest of his life the memory of that blinding light, that authoritative voice, that moment when heaven broke into his world and turned his life completely around. It was an encounter that would fuel decades of missionary journeys, inspire countless letters that would become part of the New Testament, and ultimately lead to his own martyrdom for the faith he had once tried to destroy. Years later, when Paul stood before kings and governors, when he endured shipwrecks and beatings and imprisonment for the sake of the gospel, when he planted churches across the Roman Empire and wrote words that would guide Christians for centuries to come, he would always remember that it all began on a dusty road to Damascus, when the risen Jesus called his name and asked him a simple question: "Why do you persecute me?" That encounter had taught him that the grace of God could reach anyone, that no one was beyond the possibility of redemption, and that sometimes the most unlikely people become the most powerful instruments in God's hands. But Paul's encounter with the risen Christ was not the first. Days before the light blazed around him on the Damascus road, while he was still planning his persecution of the believers, another meeting had taken place in a garden outside Jerusalem. This encounter was different in its gentleness, different in its intimacy, yet no less transformative in its power. It involved a woman whose heart had been shattered by grief, whose world had been destroyed by the crucifixion of the one person who had given her life meaning and hope. Mary Magdalene moved through the pre-dawn darkness like a woman walking in a dream of sorrow. The streets of Jerusalem were empty, except for the occasional early-rising merchant or temple servant going about their duties. The air was cool and still, carrying with it the faint scent of spices from her bundle and the distant aroma of bread from the bakeries that were already at work preparing for the day ahead. But Mary noticed none of these ordinary details. Her mind was fixed on one destination, her heart heavy with one overwhelming grief. 3 days had passed since the crucifixion, 3 days since she had watched in horror as the man who had changed her life was nailed to a cross and left to die like a common criminal. 3 days since the light had gone out of her world and hope had died in her heart. She had seen him breathe his last, had watched as Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had taken his body down from the cross and wrapped it hastily in linen cloths before laying it in the tomb. The Sabbath had prevented them from completing the burial preparations properly, and now Mary was returning to finish what love demanded. The other women who had followed Jesus had planned to come with her, but Mary could not wait for dawn. Sleep had been impossible these past 3 nights. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face contorted with pain, heard his voice crying out in agony, felt again the terrible finality of that moment when he had cried, "It is finished," and bowed his head in death. The man who had cast 7 demons out of her life, who had given her dignity and purpose, who had made her feel truly alive for the first time, was gone. As she walked through the narrow streets, Mary remembered the first time she had met Jesus. She had been living in darkness then, tormented by forces she could not understand or control, rejected by society, considered unclean and dangerous by the religious authorities. But Jesus had looked at her with eyes full of compassion rather than condemnation, had spoken to the evil spirits that plagued her with authority that could not be denied, had set her free from a bondage that had seemed eternal. In that moment of liberation, she had found not just healing, but hope. Not just freedom, but a new identity as a beloved daughter of the Most High. From that day forward, Mary had followed Jesus wherever he went. She had been part of the group of women who supported his ministry, who provided for his needs and those of his disciples from their own resources. She had listened to his teachings, had watched him heal the sick and cast out demons, had seen him raise the dead and feed the multitudes. She had witnessed miracles that defied explanation and had heard wisdom that penetrated to the very depths of the human heart. But now all of that was over. The teacher was dead. The miracle worker was silenced. The one who had brought hope to the hopeless was himself without hope in a borrowed tomb. Mary's world had collapsed so completely that she could barely remember what it had felt like to believe that anything good was possible. All she could do now was perform this final act of devotion, this last service of love for the one who had meant everything to her. The garden where Jesus had been buried was outside the city walls, in a quiet place where wealthy families maintained their tombs among olive trees and flowering shrubs. As Mary approached the burial site in the growing light of dawn, she was thinking about the practical challenges ahead. The stone that sealed the tomb was large and heavy. She had not thought to bring help to roll it away. Perhaps the gardener would assist her, or maybe some of the other women would arrive soon, and together they could manage the task. But as she rounded the bend in the path and came within sight of the tomb, Mary stopped abruptly, her bundle of spices falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. The massive stone had been rolled away from the entrance. The tomb stood open, gaping like a mouth in the grey light of early morning. Her first thought was that grave robbers had violated the resting place of her beloved teacher. Her second thought was too terrible to contemplate, that the religious authorities had taken the body to prevent the tomb from becoming a place of pilgrimage for Jesus' followers. Mary ran toward the tomb, her heart pounding with dread and desperate hope. Perhaps she was wrong. Perhaps the stone had simply been moved by the gardener for some routine maintenance. Perhaps the body was still there, waiting for her ministrations. But as she bent down and peered into the dark interior of the tomb, her worst fears were confirmed. The shelf where Jesus' body had been laid was empty except for the linen grave cloths, neatly folded as if someone had carefully unwrapped them rather than hastily torn them away. The reality of what she was seeing was too overwhelming to process. Mary stumbled backward from the tomb entrance, her mind reeling with confusion and fresh grief. It was not enough that Jesus had been killed. Now even his body had been taken from her. She would not even have the small comfort of caring for his remains, of completing the burial rites that would have been her final gift to him. Everything was gone. The teacher, the body, the hope, the future she had imagined impossible as it was that they would ever have a future together without the constant threat of death. Through her tears, Mary saw two figures in white sitting where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and one at the foot of where he had lain. Their presence should have frightened her, for their appearance was clearly not of this world, but her grief was so overwhelming that she barely registered their supernatural nature. When they asked her why she was weeping, she replied with the simple, heartbroken truth, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Even as she spoke these words, Mary became aware of another presence behind her. She turned and saw a man standing in the garden, silhouetted against the growing light of dawn. Through her tears he appeared to be the gardener, perhaps arriving early to tend to his plants, or to investigate the disturbance at the tomb. When he too asked why she was weeping and whom she was seeking, Mary's response came from the very depths of her desperate love. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." It was an impossible offer, really. Mary was a woman alone, with no means to transport a body, no place to take it even if she could. But love does not always speak reasonably. Love makes promises it cannot keep, offers services it cannot perform, simply because the heart must express itself somehow when words seem inadequate to convey the depth of its devotion. The man in the garden stood quietly for a moment, and in that silence something shifted in the very fabric of reality. The ordinary morning was about to become extraordinary. The natural world was about to be invaded by the supernatural, and Mary's grief was about to be transformed into a joy beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. Then he spoke her name, just one word: Mary. But it was spoken in a voice she recognized instantly, a voice she had heard teaching crowds and comforting the sorrowful, a voice that had called her out of darkness and into light, a voice that had been silenced by death but was now speaking her name with all the love and gentleness she remembered. Mary spun around, her tears suddenly forgotten, her heart leaping with an impossible hope. "Rabboni!" "Dat!" she cried, using the Aramaic word for teacher, the title that expressed not just respect, but deep personal affection and devotion. In that moment of recognition, Mary's world was recreated. Death had been conquered, hope was restored, and the man she thought she had lost forever was standing before her alive and whole. She moved toward him instinctively, wanting to embrace him, to touch him, to convince herself that this was real, and not simply a grief-induced hallucination. But Jesus gently stopped her with words that spoke of a new kind of relationship, a new phase of existence that was just beginning. "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." These words were puzzling to Mary, but their essential message was clear. The resurrection was not simply a return to the old life, but the beginning of something entirely new. Jesus was alive, but he was alive in a way that transcended the limitations of ordinary human existence. He would not be staying with them as he had before, but he would be going to prepare a place for them in his Father's house, to open a way for all of them to follow. More importantly for Mary in that moment, she had been given a mission. She was to be the first messenger of the resurrection, the one who would carry the news of victory over death to the grieving disciples. The woman whom society had once rejected, whom the demons had once tormented, whom grief had nearly destroyed, was now chosen to be the apostle to the apostles, the herald of the greatest news in human history. As Jesus faded from her sight, Mary stood alone in the garden, but she was no longer the same woman who had arrived there in the darkness before dawn. The grief that had weighed down her heart like a stone had been replaced by a joy so overwhelming that she could hardly contain it. The world that had seemed dark and hopeless just moments before was now bright with infinite possibility. Death itself had been defeated, and nothing would ever be the same. Mary ran back to Jerusalem, her feet barely touching the ground, her heart overflowing with the news she had been entrusted to share. She found the disciples huddled together in fear and grief, and to them she proclaimed the words that would change the world. "I have seen the Lord." The woman who had once been tormented by demons had become the first witness to the resurrection, the first to see the risen Christ, the first to carry the news that death had lost its sting and the grave had lost its victory. The encounter in the garden had lasted only minutes, but its impact would ripple through history. Mary had learned that love that seems destroyed can be restored, that hope that appears lost can be found again, that death is not the end of the story but the beginning of a new chapter. Most importantly, she had discovered that when all seems lost, when grief seems overwhelming, when the future appears impossible, divine love is still present, still active, still working to bring light out of darkness and life out of death. The garden where Mary met the risen Jesus would be remembered forever as a place where sorrow was turned to joy, where death was revealed to be a defeated enemy, where a grieving woman became the first messenger of humanity's greatest hope. And Mary herself would be remembered not as the woman from whom 7 demons had been cast out, but as the woman who was first to see the risen Christ, first to hear his voice on that Easter morning, first to carry the news that would transform the world. These encounters, Jacob wrestling with the divine stranger, Moses hearing the voice from the burning bush, Isaiah witnessing the throne of glory, Paul confronting the risen Christ, Mary discovering Jesus alive in the garden, were not isolated incidents that began and ended with the individuals who experienced them. Like ripples spreading across the surface of a still pond, the effects of these meetings between heaven and earth expanded outward, touching countless lives across generations and continents, shaping the spiritual understanding of humanity in ways that continue to unfold even today. In the months and years that followed Mary's announcement that she had seen the Lord, something remarkable began to happen throughout the ancient world. The news she carried from the garden spread like wildfire among the small communities of believers, and from there it reached into the hearts of people who had never heard of Jesus during his earthly ministry. Slaves in Roman households whispered the story to one another in the early hours before dawn. Merchants carried the tale along trade routes that stretched from Jerusalem to the far corners of the empire. Soldiers stationed in distant garrisons heard fragments of the account and found their hearts stirred by hope they had never known before. The transformation was not merely in what people believed, but in how they lived. Communities that had been divided by race, class, and culture began to discover a unity that transcended all human barriers. In a world where might made right and the powerful crushed the weak without consequence, followers of the risen Jesus began to demonstrate a different way of being human. They cared for orphans and widows, visited prisoners, healed the sick without payment, and shared their possessions with those in need. The encounter that had begun in a garden with a grieving woman had become a movement that would eventually reshape civilization itself. Paul, carrying within his heart the memory of that blazing light on the Damascus road, became the great architect of this transformation. His journeys across the Mediterranean world were not merely missionary expeditions, but living demonstrations of how a divine encounter could redirect an entire life toward purposes beyond imagination. In every city he visited, Paul would tell the story of his meeting with the risen Christ, and invariably there would be those who recognized in his account something that resonated with their own deepest longings for meaning and truth. The communities Paul established were laboratories of divine encounter, places where ordinary people discovered that the same Jesus who had appeared to him on the Damascus road was still present, still available, still ready to transform lives and hearts. They gathered in homes and marketplaces, in synagogues and public squares, sharing stories of their own encounters with the divine presence. Some experienced dramatic visions like Paul's, while others discovered God in quieter moments of prayer and reflection. But all found that their lives had been fundamentally altered by these meetings with the sacred. The influence of Isaiah's vision of divine holiness began to permeate the worship and spiritual understanding of these early Christian communities. The prophet's description of the seraphim crying, "Holy, holy, holy," became incorporated into their prayers and liturgies, reminding them that the God they served was not merely a human projection or philosophical concept, but the awesome, transcendent Creator before whom even the angels veiled their faces. Yet they also learned from Isaiah's experience that this holy God was not distant or unapproachable, but actively seeking to purify human hearts and commission ordinary people for extraordinary service. The story of Moses in the burning bush provided a framework for understanding how God could be simultaneously transcendent and immanent, utterly other yet intimately present. The flames that burned without consuming became a powerful metaphor for the way divine presence could fill human lives without destroying human identity. Communities of believers began to understand that they too could become burning bushes, places where the divine presence dwelt in such a way that others could see and experience God's reality without being overwhelmed or destroyed by it. Jacob's wrestling match by the river Jabbok offered yet another dimension to the growing understanding of what it meant to encounter God. His experience taught believers that meeting the divine was not always comfortable or easy, that sometimes spiritual growth required struggle, persistence, and a willingness to hold on to faith even when the outcome was uncertain. The limp that Jacob carried for the rest of his life became a symbol of how divine encounters often leave permanent marks on those who experience them, changes that serve as constant reminders of the reality of God's presence and power. As decades passed, these stories began to take on lives of their own, inspiring countless individuals to seek their own encounters with the divine. Hermits withdrew to desert caves, hoping to experience the kind of solitude that had prepared Moses for his meeting with God at the burning bush. Contemplatives spent hours in prayer and meditation, longing to see the throne of glory that Isaiah had witnessed in the temple. Martyrs faced death with courage drawn from the certainty that the same Jesus who had appeared to Paul and Mary was waiting to receive them into eternal life. But the influence of these encounters was not limited to those who explicitly followed Jesus. The ethical teachings that flowed from these experiences began to influence legal systems and social structures throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. The radical notion that every human being possessed inherent dignity because they were created in the image of God began to challenge slavery, improve the treatment of prisoners, and elevate the status of women and children. The idea that power should be used to serve rather than to dominate, drawn from Jesus' own example and teachings, began to reshape concepts of leadership and governance. Schools and universities were established based on the principle that knowledge and learning were gifts to be shared rather than hoarded, reflecting the generous spirit that characterized those who had experienced divine grace. Hospitals and orphanages were founded by communities that understood their calling to be instruments of divine compassion in a world marked by suffering and need. Art and music flourished as believers sought to express the beauty and glory they had glimpsed through the accounts of those who had encountered God directly. The encounters that had taken place in specific moments and locations began to echo across time and geography in ways that defied natural explanation. A fisherman on the shores of the Sea of Galilee would find himself wrestling with the same questions that had troubled Jacob by the river Jabbok. A young woman in a monastery in medieval Europe would experience a vision that bore striking similarities to Isaiah's encounter with the seraphim in the temple. A philosopher in ancient Athens would hear in Paul's words about the unknown God an echo of truths he had sensed but never been able to articulate. As the centuries unfolded, each generation discovered new depths of meaning in these ancient encounters. Theologians wrote volumes exploring the theological implications of Moses' conversation with God in the burning bush. Poets composed verses inspired by Mary's joy in the garden on Easter morning. Artists created masterpieces attempting to capture the glory that Isaiah witnessed in his vision of the divine throne. Musicians composed symphonies that tried to give voice to the wordless wonder experienced by all who truly encounter the living God. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of how these encounters echoed through history was the way they continued to happen. The God who had wrestled with Jacob, spoken to Moses, appeared to Isaiah, confronted Paul, and revealed himself to Mary did not retire from active involvement in human affairs once these famous meetings were concluded. Instead, these encounters became patterns, templates that helped ordinary people recognize when the extraordinary was breaking into their own lives. A mother caring for a sick child would suddenly sense a presence that gave her strength beyond her own. A farmer working in his fields would find himself aware of a glory that transformed ordinary soil and growing plants into sacraments of divine creativity. A scholar studying ancient texts would experience moments of insight that seemed to come from beyond human reasoning. A prisoner facing execution would discover a peace that surpassed understanding, knowing with absolute certainty that death was not the end of the story. Each of these encounters, whether dramatic or subtle, whether experienced by famous individuals or completely unknown people, added to the growing testimony that the divine was not absent from human experience, but intimately involved in the details of everyday life. The God who had called to Moses from a burning bush was still speaking, though not always from flames that refused to be consumed. The Jesus who had appeared to Mary in a garden was still revealing himself, though not always in the dawn light of Easter morning. The cumulative effect of countless divine encounters across the centuries was to create a new understanding of what it meant to be human. People began to see themselves not as mere accidents of evolution or products of impersonal natural forces, but as beings created for communion with the divine, capable of receiving revelations that could transform not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. They discovered that they lived in a universe where the sacred and the ordinary intersected at every moment, where the divine presence was as close as their next breath and as vast as the farthest star. In our modern world, with its emphasis on scientific rationalism and technological advancement, it might seem that such encounters with the divine have become relics of a more superstitious past. The burning bushes of ancient times have been replaced by electric lights. The wilderness places where prophets received their visions have been developed into shopping centres and office complexes, and the quiet gardens where resurrection appearances once occurred have given way to busy urban landscapes filled with noise and distraction. Yet those who look carefully will discover that encounters with the divine continue to happen, often in the most unexpected places and ways. A surgeon in a modern hospital, working through the night to save a life that hangs in the balance, suddenly finds her hands guided by a wisdom and skill that seems to come from beyond her training and experience. In that moment, surrounded by the beeping of monitors and the sterile environment of the operating room, she encounters the same divine presence that once guided the hands of ancient healers. The technology may be different, but the mystery of life-touching life, of healing flowing through human instruments, remains unchanged. A teacher in an inner-city school, facing a classroom of children who have been written off by society as failures and troublemakers, discovers an inexplicable patience and love filling her heart. As she looks into the eyes of a young boy whose anger masks deep pain, she sees beyond the surface hostility to the precious soul beneath. In that moment of divine insight, she experiences what Isaiah felt when the coal touched his lips and cleansed him for service. Her words become instruments of transformation. Her classroom becomes a holy place where wounded hearts begin to heal. A businessman climbing the ladder of corporate success and accumulating wealth and power finds himself sitting alone in his office late one evening, strangely empty despite all his achievements. As he stares out the window at the city lights below, he experiences a profound sense that there must be more to existence than quarterly profits and market share. In that moment of spiritual awakening, he encounters the same divine discontent that drove Moses from the comfort of Egyptian palace life into the wilderness where God would meet him at a burning bush. A mother, holding her newborn child for the first time, is overwhelmed by a love so powerful and pure that it seems to transform her very essence. Looking into those tiny, innocent eyes, she glimpses something of the divine love that created and sustains all life. In that sacred moment in a hospital delivery room, surrounded by the sounds and smells of modern medicine, she experiences the same wonder that Mary felt when she first encountered the Christ child, the same awe that filled Jacob when he realized he had been wrestling with the divine. These modern encounters may not be accompanied by dramatic visions or audible voices from heaven, but they carry the same transformative power that characterized the meetings between God and humanity in ancient times. The divine presence adapts itself to each generation, speaking in languages and through circumstances that can be understood by contemporary hearts, yet never losing its essential character as the source of love, truth, and ultimate meaning. A scientist, studying the intricate patterns of DNA or the vast structures of galaxies, finds herself filled with a sense of wonder that transcends mere intellectual curiosity. The elegant mathematical relationships that govern the universe, the incredible complexity that emerges from simple rules, the fine-tuning that allows life to exist at all. These discoveries become windows into the mind of the Creator. Like Moses encountering the burning bush, she realizes she is standing on holy ground, that the natural world itself is ablaze with divine presence for those who have eyes to see. An artist, struggling to capture on canvas or in stone some truth that burns within his soul, experiences moments when his work seems to flow from a source beyond his conscious mind. Colours blend in ways he never planned, melodies emerge that he never composed, words appear on the page that seem to come from beyond his own vocabulary. In these moments of creative inspiration, he touches the same divine creativity that spoke the universe into existence, that continues to bring beauty and meaning out of chaos and emptiness. A social worker, walking through the streets of a city plagued by poverty and violence, finds herself seeing not just the surface desperation, but the image of God that persists even in the most broken lives. She encounters the divine not in a temple or church, but in the face of a homeless veteran, in the eyes of an abandoned child, in the trembling hands of an elderly woman who has no one left to care for her. Like Isaiah, she learns that true holiness is not about avoiding contamination from the world's pain, but about allowing divine love to flow through human hands to bring healing and hope. A husband and wife, working through the challenges of a long marriage, discover moments of grace when their love for each other seems to transcend the ordinary bounds of human affection. In times of forgiveness after hurt, of patience during illness, of faithfulness through difficulty, they experience something of the divine love that never gives up, never stops hoping, never fails to find a way forward. Their bedroom becomes a sanctuary, their kitchen table becomes an altar, their shared life becomes a living testimony to the truth that divine love can inhabit the most ordinary spaces and transform them into places of wonder. A student, wrestling with questions about the meaning of life and their place in the universe, finds themselves drawn into philosophical discussions that seem to reach beyond the confines of any textbook or lecture hall. In moments of insight when complex ideas suddenly become clear, when the connections between seemingly unrelated concepts become visible, when the beauty of truth itself takes their breath away, they experience something of what Jacob felt during his night of wrestling with the divine. Their struggle with ultimate questions becomes itself a form of prayer. Their search for truth becomes a pilgrimage toward encounter with the source of all truth. Even in the midst of suffering and loss, modern people discover that encounters with the divine are not limited to times of joy and success. A father, watching his child battle a terminal illness, finds strength and peace that he cannot explain or understand. A woman facing the loss of her job and home discovers a security that does not depend on external circumstances. A community, devastated by natural disaster or human violence, experiences a sense of hope and solidarity that seems to come from beyond their own resources. These encounters often come quietly, without fanfare or dramatic signs. A quiet moment of awareness while washing dishes becomes a time of deep communion with the divine presence. A walk in the park becomes a journey into sacred space where every leaf and flower speaks of creative love. A conversation with a friend becomes a moment of revelation where divine wisdom is shared through human words. A simple act of kindness to a stranger becomes a sacrament where both giver and receiver encounter the God who is love. The technology that fills our modern world, rather than eliminating opportunities for divine encounter, often becomes the means through which such meetings occur. A message received at just the right moment provides exactly the encouragement needed to continue through a difficult time. A song heard on the radio carries words that speak directly to a heart struggling with doubt or fear. A photograph shared on social media becomes the catalyst for reconnection with an old friend or the beginning of a new relationship that will prove life-changing. Medical professionals working in hospitals and clinics regularly witness what can only be described as miraculous healings, recoveries that defy medical explanation, moments when life triumphs over death in ways that transcend the power of human intervention. These modern-day resurrections may not make headlines, but they continue the pattern established when Jesus appeared to Mary in the garden, demonstrating that life is stronger than death, that hope is more powerful than despair. Counselors and therapists find themselves facilitating transformations in their clients that go far beyond what psychological techniques alone can accomplish. Deep wounds that have festered for years suddenly begin to heal. Destructive patterns that have dominated entire lifetimes are broken in moments of insight and grace. People discover inner strength and wisdom that they never knew they possessed. In these healing encounters, both helper and helped often recognize the presence of something greater than themselves, something that makes wholeness possible even after the deepest brokenness. Teachers in classrooms around the world experience moments when their words seem to carry power beyond their own knowledge or eloquence. A struggling student suddenly understands a concept that has been elusive. A discouraged learner discovers talents they never knew they had. A classroom full of diverse personalities comes together in harmony around a shared discovery. In these moments, education becomes more than the transfer of information. It becomes a participation in the divine work of enlightening human minds and hearts. The sacred continues to break into the ordinary, the eternal continues to touch the temporal, and human hearts continue to be transformed by encounters with the divine presence. The forms may change, the settings may be different, but the essential reality remains the same. We live in a world where God is actively present, where divine love seeks opportunities to touch human lives, where encounters with the sacred remain as possible today as they were when Jacob wrestled with his mysterious opponent by the river Jabbok. When we step back and look at all these encounters across time and culture, certain patterns begin to emerge that help us understand the nature of divine meetings and what makes them possible. Whether we examine Jacob's wrestling match, Moses' conversation with the burning bush, Isaiah's vision of the throne, Paul's confrontation on the Damascus road, Mary's recognition in the garden, or any of the countless encounters that continue to occur in our modern world, we discover common threads that weave through them all like golden strands in a rich tapestry. The first and perhaps most important characteristic of every authentic encounter with the divine is that it comes as a gift rather than as an achievement. None of these individuals earned their experiences through superior righteousness or spiritual discipline. Jacob was a deceiver running from the consequences of his actions. Moses was a fugitive hiding in the wilderness. Isaiah was simply going about his normal religious duties in the temple. Paul was actively persecuting the very people God was calling him to serve. Mary was a woman overwhelmed by grief, seeking only to perform a final act of love for someone she thought was dead. In each case, the divine initiative reached out to people who were in no position to demand or deserve such encounters. This pattern reveals something profound about the nature of God's character. Divine love is not conditional upon human merit. Divine grace is not reserved for those who have achieved some level of spiritual perfection. Divine presence is not limited to those who have followed all the right religious formulas. Instead, these encounters demonstrate that God seeks out the broken, the confused, the struggling, the ordinary, and transforms them through the power of divine love. Another common element in these sacred meetings is that they often occur during times of transition or crisis. Jacob encountered the divine stranger on the night before he was to face his estranged brother after 20 years of separation. Moses met God at the burning bush when he was living in exile, far from his people who were suffering under Egyptian oppression. Isaiah's vision came during a time of political upheaval following the death of King Uzziah. Paul's encounter happened as he was traveling to Damascus to intensify his persecution of Christians. Mary's meeting with the risen Jesus occurred in the depths of her grief over his crucifixion. These moments of crisis or transition seem to create openings in the human heart where divine presence can enter more easily. When our normal routines are disrupted, when our comfortable assumptions are challenged, when our usual sources of security are removed, we become more aware of our need for something beyond ourselves. The defenses we normally maintain, the busyness that usually fills our minds, the illusions of self-sufficiency that ordinarily shield us from deeper realities. All of these barriers become more permeable during times of uncertainty and change. Yet divine encounters are not limited to moments of crisis. They can also occur in the midst of ordinary activities, transforming mundane moments into sacred spaces. Moses was simply tending his sheep when he noticed the bush that burned without being consumed. Mary was performing what she thought would be a routine task of caring for the dead when she met the risen Christ. Many modern encounters happen during the most everyday activities: walking the dog, washing dishes, driving to work, tucking children into bed. This reveals another crucial aspect of divine encounters. They require a certain quality of attention and openness. Moses could have walked past the burning bush without stopping to investigate. Mary could have fled from the garden when she discovered the empty tomb. Isaiah could have dismissed his vision as the product of an overactive imagination. Paul could have attributed the light and voice to natural phenomena or psychological stress. But in each case, these individuals possessed a willingness to stop, to look more closely, to remain present to mystery even when it challenged their understanding of how the world worked. They demonstrated a quality of spiritual alertness that allowed them to recognize the sacred when it appeared, even when it came in unexpected forms or at inconvenient times. This openness to mystery seems to be cultivated by certain practices and attitudes that prepare the heart for divine encounter. Solitude plays an important role in many of these meetings. Jacob was alone by the river when his wrestling match began. Moses was alone with his flock when he saw the burning bush. Isaiah was apparently alone in the temple when his vision occurred. Even in our modern world, many people report that their most significant spiritual experiences happen during times of quietness and solitude, when the noise of daily life is temporarily set aside. But solitude alone is not enough. There must also be a hunger for something more than what ordinary life provides, a sense that there are depths of reality that remain unexplored, mysteries that call out for investigation. This spiritual hunger may express itself as a longing for meaning, a desire for connection with something greater than ourselves, a need for hope in the face of life's difficulties, or simply a curiosity about the deeper dimensions of existence. Prayer, in its many forms, also seems to create favourable conditions for divine encounter. This prayer may be formal and liturgical, like the worship Isaiah was participating in at the temple, or it may be the wordless cry of a heart in distress, like Mary's grief-stricken search for her beloved teacher. It may be the desperate bargaining of someone facing an impossible situation, or the simple acknowledgement that human wisdom and strength are insufficient for life's challenges. What matters is not the eloquence or orthodoxy of the prayer, but the genuineness of the heart that offers it. Divine encounters seem to happen most readily when people approach the sacred with honesty about their own limitations and needs, when they admit their dependence on sources of wisdom and strength beyond themselves, when they express their deepest longings without pretense or self-protection. Another pattern that emerges from studying these encounters is that they always involve both mystery and clarity. The people who experience them are often left with questions they cannot answer alongside truths they cannot doubt. Jacob never learned the identity of his wrestling partner, but he was certain that he had encountered the divine. Moses received clear instructions about his mission to Egypt, but the nature of the God who spoke to him from the burning bush remained largely mysterious. Isaiah was given a specific commission as a prophet, but his vision of the divine throne was too overwhelming to be fully comprehended or described. This combination of mystery and clarity seems to be intentional. Divine encounters provide enough clarity to guide human action and decision-making, enough certainty to sustain faith through difficult times, enough truth to transform lives and relationships. But they also preserve enough mystery to prevent people from reducing God to manageable concepts, enough questions to keep hearts and minds open to continued growth and discovery, enough wonder to maintain a sense of awe and reverence. The transformative power of these encounters is another universal characteristic. No one who authentically meets the divine remains unchanged. Jacob became Israel, receiving not only a new name, but a new identity and destiny. Moses was transformed from a fugitive shepherd into the great liberator and lawgiver of his people. Isaiah was changed from a worshipper into a prophet. Paul was converted from persecutor to apostle. Mary evolved from follower to herald of the resurrection. But the transformation goes deeper than external roles or circumstances. Divine encounters seem to touch the very core of human identity, revealing who people truly are beneath the layers of social conditioning, personal history, and self-deception. They provide glimpses of the original design for human life, the purposes for which individuals were created, the unique contributions they are meant to make to the world. This transformative power is not limited to famous biblical figures. Throughout history and continuing today, people who experience authentic encounters with the divine find their priorities reordered, their relationships deepened, their sense of purpose clarified, their capacity for love expanded. They discover courage they never knew they possessed, wisdom that transcends their education and experience, peace that surpasses human understanding, joy that cannot be diminished by external circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, these encounters seem to awaken people to their fundamental identity as beloved children of God. Regardless of their past failures, present circumstances, or future uncertainties, they discover that they are known, valued, and cherished by the source of all existence. This realization becomes the foundation for everything else: the courage to face challenges, the motivation to serve others, the hope to persevere through difficulties, the capacity to forgive and be forgiven. As our journey through these sacred encounters draws toward its close, we arrive at perhaps the most beautiful truth of all. The divine presence that appeared to Jacob, Moses, Isaiah, Paul, and Mary has never departed from our world. The God who spoke from burning bushes still speaks, though the flames may now burn in human hearts rather than desert shrubs. The Christ who appeared in gardens still appears, though the meetings may happen in hospital rooms, classrooms, or quiet moments of personal prayer. The Holy Spirit who filled ancient temples still fills sacred spaces, though those spaces may now be found wherever 2 or 3 gather in love, wherever acts of compassion are performed, wherever hearts are open to receive divine grace. This continuing presence means that the invitation to encounter the divine extends to every person in every generation, including our own. The same God who called Moses from tending sheep to leading a nation, who transformed Paul from persecutor to apostle, who comforted Mary in her grief and commissioned her as the first herald of resurrection, continues to call ordinary people into extraordinary relationships and purposes. The divine presence that has been actively working in human history for thousands of years is still active today, still seeking hearts that are open to receive love, minds that are willing to be illuminated by truth, lives that are ready to be transformed by grace. Yet this presence is not pushy or demanding. Divine love respects human freedom too much to force itself upon unwilling hearts. Like a gentle friend waiting for an invitation to enter, God stands at the door of human consciousness and knocks softly, waiting for permission to come in and share the meal of communion that transforms strangers into family. This respect for human choice means that encounters with the divine require some level of cooperation from those who experience them, not earning or deserving, but simply a willingness to remain open to possibilities beyond what seems immediately apparent. The beautiful truth is that this openness can be cultivated. Hearts that have become hardened by disappointment can be softened through practices of gratitude and forgiveness. Minds that have become closed by cynicism can be opened through wonder and curiosity about the deeper dimensions of existence. Spirits that have become dulled by routine can be awakened through moments of silence and reflection, through attention to beauty and mystery, through acts of kindness and service to others. Those who wish to create space in their lives for divine encounter might begin by simply paying attention to the present moment with greater awareness. The sacred is not usually found in dramatic visions or supernatural phenomena, but in the ordinary moments of daily life when we suddenly notice the extraordinary that has been there all along. The dewdrop that catches the morning sunlight just so, the unexpected kindness of a stranger, the way a child's laughter can fill an entire room with joy, the peace that comes from forgiving someone who has hurt us. All of these can become doorways through which divine presence enters our awareness. Solitude, even in small doses, creates opportunities for the kind of deep listening that makes divine encounters possible. This might be as simple as sitting quietly for a few minutes each morning before the day begins, taking a walk in nature without the distraction of music or conversation, or pausing at the end of the day to reflect on the gifts and challenges that have been received. In our noisy, busy world, the practice of intentional silence can feel foreign at first, but it gradually becomes a cherished refuge where the soul can rest and the heart can hear whispers of divine love. Prayer, in whatever form feels most natural and authentic, opens channels of communication between the human and divine realms. This prayer does not need to be eloquent or theologically sophisticated. The most powerful prayers are often the simplest ones: cries for help in times of trouble, expressions of gratitude for unexpected blessings, honest admissions of confusion or doubt, or simply sitting in quiet acknowledgement of divine presence. Like Jacob's wrestling match, prayer sometimes involves struggle and persistence, but it always creates opportunities for transformation and blessing. Service to others, particularly those who are suffering or in need, frequently becomes a text for divine encounter. When we reach beyond our own concerns to care for the sick, comfort the grieving, feed the hungry, or welcome the stranger, we often discover that we are not just helping others, but are ourselves being helped by a presence that works through us, but originates beyond us. Many people report that their most profound experiences of God have come not in private prayer or worship, but in moments when they were serving as instruments of divine compassion in the world. Reading and reflecting on the stories of those who have encountered God throughout history can also prepare our hearts for our own meetings with the divine. These ancient accounts are not just historical records, but living invitations to experience the same realities they describe. When we read about Jacob's wrestling match, we may find ourselves wondering what we need to wrestle with in our own spiritual journey. When we contemplate Moses' encounter with the burning bush, we may begin to notice the places in our own lives where the sacred is breaking through in ways we had not previously recognized. Community with others who are also seeking divine encounter provides support, encouragement, and accountability for the spiritual journey. While encounters with God are ultimately personal and individual, they are often facilitated by relationships with others who share the longing for deeper meaning and connection. These communities may be formal religious congregations, informal groups of friends who meet to discuss spiritual questions, or simply relationships with individuals who seem to carry within themselves the light of divine presence. The practice of gratitude opens hearts to recognize divine blessing in ways that might otherwise be overlooked. When we train ourselves to notice and appreciate the gifts that surround us each day, the breath in our lungs, the food on our tables, the love of family and friends, the beauty of the natural world, we create an atmosphere in which divine presence can be more easily perceived and received. Gratitude shifts our focus from what we lack to what we have been given, from complaints about our circumstances to appreciation for the mysteries and wonders that fill our lives. Forgiveness, both given and received, clears away the barriers that prevent divine love from flowing freely in our lives. When we release resentment toward those who have hurt us, we create space in our hearts for healing and peace. When we accept forgiveness for our own failures and mistakes, we open ourselves to experience the unconditional love that is the foundation of all divine encounters. Like the coal that touched Isaiah's lips and cleansed him for service, forgiveness purifies the heart and prepares it for sacred meetings. The cultivation of wonder and curiosity about the deeper dimensions of existence keeps the mind and heart open to possibilities that transcend ordinary understanding. Children are naturally gifted at this kind of openness, which may explain why Jesus suggested that entering the kingdom of heaven requires becoming like little children. Adults can recapture some of this childlike wonder by approaching familiar experiences with fresh eyes, asking questions about the meaning and purpose of existence, and remaining open to mystery even in an age that prizes scientific explanation above all else. As these practices become part of the rhythm of daily life, many people discover that encounters with the divine begin to happen with greater frequency and depth. What once seemed like rare and extraordinary experiences gradually become recognized as the natural result of living with greater awareness and openness to the sacred dimensions of existence. The God who once seemed distant and unknowable becomes a constant companion whose presence can be sensed in the smallest details of everyday life. But perhaps the most important truth to remember as we conclude this exploration of divine encounters is that the initiative always belongs to God. Human practices and spiritual disciplines can prepare the heart and create favorable conditions, but they cannot manufacture encounters with the divine. Like Mary in the garden on Easter morning, we cannot make Jesus appear simply by looking for him, but when he chooses to reveal himself, our searching hearts will recognize his voice calling our names. The invitation to encounter God is extended to every human heart without exception. It does not depend on religious background, intellectual achievement, moral perfection, or social status. It requires only the willingness to acknowledge that there may be more to existence than what meets the eye, the humility to admit our need for wisdom and love beyond our own resources, and the courage to remain open to possibilities that may challenge our comfortable assumptions about how the world works. In the quiet moments before sleep, in the gentle transition between wakefulness and dreams, the heart often becomes particularly receptive to divine whispers. As consciousness relaxes its grip on the details of daily life, space opens for deeper realities to emerge. It is in such moments that many people experience their most profound encounters with the sacred, not as dramatic visions or supernatural phenomena, but as gentle touches of peace, waves of inexplicable love, or simple knowing that they are not alone in the universe. The God who wrestled with Jacob by the river, who spoke to Moses from the burning bush, who appeared in glory to Isaiah in the temple, who confronted Paul on the Damascus road, and who revealed himself to Mary in the garden, is the same God who draws near to every human heart with infinite patience and love. This divine presence does not force itself upon us, but waits with eternal gentleness for moments when we are ready to receive the gift of sacred encounter. And so, as these stories of divine meetings fade into the peaceful silence of approaching sleep, may they carry with them an invitation that extends beyond mere listening to actual experience. May the God of Jacob and Moses, of Isaiah and Paul and Mary, draw near to every heart that is open to receive divine love. May the presence that has been actively working in human history for countless generations continue that work in and through every life that is surrendered to sacred purposes. In the stillness of this moment, in the quiet space between stories and sleep, the eternal invitation remains open, waiting for any who would accept it. Come and see, come and rest, come and discover that you are more loved than you have ever dared to imagine, more valued than you have ever believed possible, more capable of transformation than you have ever dreamed. Come and encounter the God whose greatest joy is to meet with the children made in the divine image, whose deepest desire is to share with human hearts the love that creates and sustains all existence. The stories end, but the invitation continues. The encounters we have explored together point toward encounters yet to come, meetings between heaven and earth that wait to unfold in the secret places of surrendered hearts, in the quiet moments of open souls, in the sacred space where divine love and human longing finally meet in perfect, transforming communion.